Israel's strategy after October the 7th, 2023 has changed, but it's also not changed in several important ways. The first obvious instance where it has changed is in the intensity of how Israel fights wars. You know, previously, Israeli military doctrine prioritized short, sharp wars on one front only. Now, this was predicated on the assumption that Israel is a more globally connected, economically productive society than many of its neighbors, and therefore any long-term war would basically sap that economic productivity too much. It would basically exert too much of a toll on Israel's society. It would require Israel to, for example, draw on its large pool of reservists, taking them away from their families and their businesses or the places of work. And that was how Israel fought wars before October 7th. Short, sharp escalations on one front alone to try and contain the conflict and to do what Israelis call mowing the grass, i.e. basically chopping down any threats to the status quo to size rather than removing them or reshaping the map, just basically containing them. Now, after October the 7th, that seems to have all changed in that, you know, you have ministers, including Prime Minister Netanyahu and others, talking about eliminating Hamas and Hezbollah, toppling the Iranian regime, for example. So rhetorically, there's a difference. And also, of course, in strategy, there's a big difference in that Israel is now committing itself to multi-front wars. It is escalating its use of violence. Its use of violence is far more intense and widespread than ever before in the country's history, which is why you have such a high death toll in places like Gaza, but not exclusively so. So it looks like Israel has changed completely in that it is taking territory on many of its borders in Syria, in Lebanon, in Gaza, territory where previously it largely, apart from the Golan Heights, respected international borders. You have it taking territory beyond its borders, and of course you have it committing itself to very prolonged, intense military campaigns. So it looks like a lot has changed. But once you scratch the surface, you can see there's significant similarities as well. The first is mowing the grass. So it's less a case of Israel abandoning its mowing the grass strategy, more a case of Israel increasing its intensity. And what I mean there is that, yes, you see Israel reoccupy Gaza, occupy Lebanon, for example, but at the same time, something that Israel has been criticized for since the very, very start of its operations at the end of 2023 is the lack of a planning for the quote unquote day after. How do you turn military successes into long-term political gains? And Israel's never really had an answer to that. It's never provided or cultivated an alternative to Hamas in Gaza, Hezbollah in Lebanon, or indeed most recently, the Iranian regime in Tehran. It simply opts to use its qualitative military edge to degrade the capability of hostile foes to attack Israel. So this is, despite the rhetoric, despite the intensity, mowing the grass 101. In that mowing the grass, the whole point of it is to not consider an alternative political horizon. Mowing the grass is all about chopping down rivals to force them to return to the status quo. And that's exactly what Israel's doing here. So even in Gaza, for example, where the intensity of Israel's violence has been the most pronounced in terms of death tolls and a prolonged occupation, even there, Israel is basically doing the same thing it did before October the 7th. Hamas, yes, has been reduced in size, intensity, and capability to do damage to Israel. Many of its leaders have been killed. But at the same time, Hamas is still ruling over 90% of Gaza's Palestinian population, because that's been Israel's modus operandi from day one. Not to consider a day after to Hamas, but to simply chop it down to size, to contain and deter it as much as possible. Initially, that seemed like a blip. But as Israel's campaign has extended to other fronts, it seems to be actually Israel's continuing strategy, mowing the grass just on a more intense scale. Any claims by Israeli military spokespeople that Israel's response to a threat is proportionate should be treated with a pinch of salt, because a disproportionate response is how Israel fights wars. It's not an aberration. It's part of Israel's war fighting strategy. So you have mowing the grass on the one hand, and then after October the 7th, you have Israel's pursuit of strategic depth. And again, strategic depth is actually a very, very old concept in Israeli military doctrine and Israeli military strategy. It's predicated on the assumption that Israel's recognized international borders, i.e., its borders from before the Six-Day War of June 1967, are not a source of security, but they are in fact an existential threat. Abba Eban, one of Israel's early foreign ministers, someone considered relatively dovish, referred to them as Auschwitz borders, i.e. basically a recipe for the destruction of the state of Israel and an existential threat for the Jewish people as a whole, which is why Israel has always prioritized taking territory beyond its borders. And you've seen that throughout decades of Israeli warfighting. This is, it might look like something new after October the 7th, but actually it's more of a variation on a theme. One of the reasons why it's so pronounced after October the 7th is because the Israeli right have managed to, I guess, to feed a misperception to popularize and turn it mainstream. And that is that Israel left Gaza in 2005. It withdrew to the international border. It gave up its strategic depth. And as a result, it got October the 7th. Now, there is not much truth to this, simply because, starting from the very most obvious problem here, Israel actually did have a buffer zone within the Gaza Strip before October the 7th. It unilaterally declared a contiguous part of territory within Gaza around the Israel-Gaza border as a no-go zone where any Gazans who crossed into that area would put themselves in danger. And that was something that happened many times. Strategic depth is, like mowing the grass, inherently pessimistic. It's predicated on an assumption that conflict is inevitable. Fighting and violence is inevitable. So the best thing for Israel to do is not try and resolve that conflict, because it's pointless, but to push the fighting as far away as possible from Israel's borders, from its urban and commercial centers. And that's exactly what it's been trying to do in Syria, in Lebanon, in Gaza, to push the fighting away through strategic depth. Obviously, the problem with strategic depth is that when you are pushing the fighting away, you are occupying someone else's territory, and not just territory, that you're also controlling the lives of the people that live in that territory. And this dynamic can go on indefinitely. Don't forget that Israel captured the Golan Heights in 1967 and refused to return it because it sees it as a necessary buffer zone to keep Israel safe. After the Assad regime fell in December of 2024, Israel then unilaterally occupied the disengagement zone on the Syrian side of the Golan Heights. And they argued that it needs a buffer zone to protect the Golan Heights. So what Israel has actually created now is a buffer zone to protect its buffer zone. And one of the reasons why Israel and Syria haven't reached an agreement yet is because Israel is demanding that all territory south of Damascus, Syrian territory, be demilitarized because it needs to protect its forces in the UN zone. So it is literally demanding a buffer zone to protect a buffer zone to protect a buffer zone. So this is a dynamic that can go on indefinitely, regardless of any lack of ideological claims or over the territory. And we're seeing, in Lebanon, we're seeing, again, how strategic depth can affect the dynamics of the country. Lebanon is obviously a country that is deeply divided along sectarian and religious lines. And Israel is stirring those divisions because what it's done is it's occupied southern Lebanon, and rather than try and cultivate connections to most of the Lebanese civilians within that territory, it has in fact expelled them. Though it has primarily expelled Shia Lebanese, Christians and Sunnis, have more often than not been allowed to stay in place. So this is really unleashing the sectarian genie from the bottle, but it also shows that Israel is not interested in cultivating good relations or trying to win over the civilian populations, rather than see that strategic depth is a flawed security doctrine that makes conflict worse and can often create monsters. By the way, when Israel was occupying Lebanon previously in 1982, this is actually what led to the creation of Hezbollah. So rather than recognize the failings of the doctrine, Israel seems to have responded to its own inabilities to win a counterinsurgency in these territories by simply expelling the people within those territories. It's done that in Gaza, where it now controls way over 50% of the Gaza Strip, but has emptied the territory it controls of Gaza's inhabitants. It's doing that in Lebanon. It's doing the same thing, by the way, in the West Bank, where it's trying to empty Area C, territory within its control, of the Palestinian residents of that territory. So it's all about squeezing the hostile populations into smaller and smaller territories in order for Israel to have strategic depth. But the obvious issue here is that strategic depth does not eliminate conflict. It can often make conflict worse, and it sinks Israel into a path dependency of occupation. It's worth noting that when Israel formed its last so-called security zone in southern Lebanon in the mid-1980s, Defense Minister Shimon Peres claimed that this would be Israel's last winter in Lebanon. And in fact, Israel only withdrew from Lebanon 15 years later because that occupation gave birth to Hezbollah. It created a monster. So there was so much friction between occupier and occupied that Hezbollah was legitimized and emerged and kind of created its modus operandi as a resistance actor. So that shows you that occupation is not a solution to security problems. It can exacerbate them. And also, at the same time, Israel sinks into this occupation trap where it feels like it wants to leave. It knows the occupation isn't working, but it also feels like it can't leave because there's too many threats that are created and sustained by the occupation. So, in short, all of this is a recipe for further chaos. It's based on myths from Israel's far right that unfortunately the Israeli public, or large swathes of the Israeli public, have bought hook, line and sinker. And it is a recipe for further chaos and further conflict in the region.